This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All. This week I'm speaking to bonsai expert John Hanby. John has decades of experience studying and creating bonsai trees and has just released an incredibly comprehensive guide called The Practical Art of Bonsai. We talk about selecting a plant, how to train it, and artistic methods. And we finish with John's thoughts on how bonsai techniques relate to and inform wider gardening practices. My first question to John was, what actually is a bonsai tree?
Well, the literal translation is a tree in a tray. But basically, I think most people tend to appreciate that you are trying to create a miniature tree that's going to be kept in a container, and a small container. And I think that's the fascination for a lot of people before they get into bonsai, the prospect of having to have a full-grown tree, basically, but miniaturized in a container in your own home or garden. And I think this is what fires a lot of people up. But that's the just simple translation. Some people do tend to think that, like we have an oak tree, we have a bonsai tree, but bonsai is more about the process rather than it's not a specific type of tree. So all the trees we use are just natural trees, basically.
I remember one of my tutors at college telling me that tree was a slightly problematic term in terms of botany. And I think tree is probably quite open to interpretation. So with that in mind, can you bonsai anything, or does it have to be a particular species that would normally be a tree?
No, we can make trees out of virtually anything. So obviously, if something's got a stem that looks like bark, that has bark on it, then that makes it look more convincing. And if you're working with things that have a small leaf naturally, then again, it makes it easier to create that true sort of looking finished image. People sometimes struggle if they're working with things like chestnuts and oak trees because the leaves are naturally large. So we can get the leaf size down, but it does take time. So if you're working with something like Cotoneaster, which is just a normal, easily attainable, this has a small leaf, and so it makes it much easier to create that image. Any sort of hedging material, that responds well to pruning is generally good for bonsai. So I dug a stump out of a garden, an old privet stump out of a hedge, and this had a real big trunk to it, and I grew all the branches on. And then I think it was about maybe 10 or 12 years after I'd worked on this tree, it appeared on the front cover of an international bonsai magazine that was translated into 6 languages and sold throughout the world. And so I use this to inspire my beginners that you start with something quite humble, but it can achieve greater things. So we can literally use most trees, shrubs, almost anything for bonsai. So it means that you can acquire things from your own garden.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that is one of my questions, which is, can you start one from a seed or a cutting? And if you were to do that, would you need a phenomenal amount of patience? Because would it take you a long time to achieve something that looked attractive, for example?
To be honest, in the past, I've tended to consider these seed kits that you often see advertised as a bit of consai rather than bonsai. They have a picture of this fantastic bonsai on the front of the box, and it might just say plant, water, grow, and it just gives you the impression that you plant the seed, you water it, and it's going to turn into this amazing bonsai, and this is never going to happen. And often when you plant seeds, it may take you 2 years or 3 years to get the seedling to maybe 3 or 4 inches in height. So there's nothing you can do to it. So with the best will in the world, it's hard to be so patient and get something out of the hobby. Whereas we can show you much quicker ways of creating bonsai, so that instead of growing up from a seedling or a cutting, you can actually grow down by getting a big stump that's already in your garden and growing branches on. So you've already got the heavy trunk, then you grow branches onto it. So there are much quicker ways of creating bonsai, but some people do like to have a go with seeds and cuttings, but it does take a lot of patience, I must admit.
And the other thing that you mentioned in your book, which I thought was really interesting, and I wondered if you could explain the reasoning or the mechanics behind it. But you say that a small tree won't eventually become a large tree necessarily. And just wondered why that was.
If you've got your bonsai growing in a pot and we're training it and pruning it, then the fact that it's contained in the pot and the fact that you're working on it and sort of controlling its growth, so it's never going to grow into something huge, if you like. It's not going to double in size, or it will over a period of time. The trunk will get thicker, the branches will get thicker, it will grow slightly. But because you're containing it and controlling its growth, if you think of a tree in nature, this tree is just allowed to grow. So the tree just wants to reach up for the sky, and it just keeps growing and growing. And interestingly, if you've been working on your bonsai, shall we say, for 10 years or something, and you got it looking nice, but then you decided you didn't want to do it anymore and you took it out of the pot and planted it in the garden, then if you left it alone, in time, it would just grow back to being the full-size tree in nature. So it would grow again and just be a huge tree. But it's just the fact that you're containing it and controlling its growth that is going to keep it to that size. So that's why I say in my book that if when you went to the garden centre to buy your first bonsai, you were wanting a tree that, shall we say, 12 inches tall, don't buy one at 6 inches tall because it's cheaper, thinking it's going to grow into the one at 12 inches, because unless you put it back in the ground to grow it on, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, interesting. So what are you actually aiming for overall when you bonsai? Are there some key principles that you need to be looking out for and sticking to?
In the first instance, you probably take inspiration from nature. So when you're trying to create your miniature tree bonsai, you can recollect trees, images of trees that you've seen when you've been out walking. So if you pay more attention to trees when you're out walking, then you can recreate their natural qualities in the tree you're creating. So you're looking at a heavy trunk with a good flare at the bottom and exposed roots on the soil surface. The trunk should ideally taper. The lower branches should be heavier than the younger branches at the top of the tree. So the branches should get progressively thinner as they're going up the trunk. And just by observing nature and looking at these different things, if you can incorporate that into the tree that you're creating, then you're more likely to have a natural image. Sometimes, though, people see pictures of bonsai in Japan, and these are amazing old trees with big, broad canopies, and they're so perfect. They're not really like a tree you can relate to in the wild, but they have their own magnificence because they're so perfect. So it's almost like the Japanese were saying to Mother Nature, look, this is how you should create trees. So when we're doing our bonsai, there are two sources of inspiration. One is trees that we've seen in the wild, and the other is the magnificent bonsai we've seen in Japan. And so you have to have an idea in your mind as to what type of tree you're trying to create when you set out working on your own material.
So you get the sort of convergence of the two things. And getting a little bit more into the technicalities of it, I wondered, could you just explain the principle behind directional pruning? Because I'm guessing that's really important in terms of achieving the shape that you want in the long run.
When your shoot extends on the periphery of the tree and you want to prune it back, as you go back along the stem, you will see the dormant buds along the stem. So when you prune back, if you prune back just in front of the bud where you wanted to prune the branch back to, that is where the shoot is going to grow from again. So if you want the branch to grow to the left, then you prune back to a bud that's facing to the left. If you want the branch to go to the right, then you prune back to a bud that's facing out towards the right-hand side. Where you sort of make the cut on the stem, depending on where the bud is, will direct that branch in the direction you want it to go.
Also, you mentioned wiring. Again, is that to do with the overall shape of the tree?
In the past, bonsai enthusiasts have come in for some criticism, especially from gardeners and people where they say that the fact that we wire trees is cruel. And, in the past, you've heard tales of tortured and twisted plants in Japan. But basically, if you think of a gardener who maybe wants a shrub or climbing plant to grow over a pergola or a shed or something, then he fastens it in place to train it to grow exactly where he wants it to grow. So when we wire the branches, we are wiring those branches so that we get them in exactly the right place that we want them. So that then when the branches all come together, everything perfectly placed, it creates that image that you're really trying to achieve. So in Japan, when you get a specimen bonsai that stands in an exhibition looking so magnificent and perfect without any wire on, that tree may have been wired 30 or 40 times during his life to get those branches to then sit exactly where you want them without any wire on. So wiring is basically just a means to an end. It's a training technique. We wire the branches and we leave it on as long as we can to set the branches in place. As soon as we see it starting to bite into the branches, then we remove it.
Thinking as well about how you look after your tree and the sort of look you want to achieve is with it. I've noticed as well that you mentioned that there are indoor and outdoor bonsais. So it's really interesting to hear you say that actually a lot of people start with indoor ones and quickly progress to the outdoor ones because there's more scope. What are the sort of basic differences between the two, apart from the fact one's in and one's outdoors?
The trees that are sold as indoor bonsai in garden centres and shops, basically, most of them are imported from China, but they are sort of subtropical species. So they come from sort of warmer climates than ours. So when you keep those trees indoors, you're trying to recreate their natural environment, albeit artificially. So that's why they need to be in a windowsill, a bright window, where they're getting as much natural light as possible. But they can cope with that extra warmth that there is inside. They're not sort of frost-proof, so you can't really put them out in the winter. You can put them outside in the summer, but certainly not in the winter months. But I think most people, when they're buying a bonsai tree as a gift or buying their first tree, because it's maybe something a little bit special and cherished, they want to keep it inside. So the indoor bonsai market seems to be tailor-made to gifts and people looking for their first tree. But then once people get into bonsai, they realise that all the best subjects are the outdoor trees, the pines, the junipers, the maples, the flowering trees, the fruiting trees. There's just so much more scope. And because you're growing the outdoor tree in its natural environment, they are easier to look after. So that's why often people start with an indoor tree, but most of my customers, my students now, they would never look at indoor trees. It's just all of outdoor trees. And certainly the outdoor trees are that much bit easier to look after once you master the basics.
So if you had an outdoor one, I'm guessing that you are relying a lot more on nature to water it. And that's one of the things I've found tricky in the past and I have put my hands up. I have actually murdered a few bonsai trees in my time. And I think my problem was the watering. Are there any tips that you can give in general if people are trying to get that right? Because it is tricky when you've got a very small root system, I guess.
I think watering is the hardest thing to master in bonsai. Often when people have problems with trees, it's because they've maybe had too much water or not enough water. Often when people have an indoor bonsai, they gradually get used to looking after it. They know when to water it. But then when they go on holiday or away and they leave it to a teenager or a friend or relative, then this is often where it goes wrong because they just maybe haven't a clue how to water it. And so when they come back, often the tree is in poor condition. I once made the national newspaper with a little snippet of news because I'd been interviewed for the local press, and it happened to come out in the conversation that we did a tree sitting service for people when they went on holiday. So because it was like, taking your dog to the kennels, people were bringing the trees to me. This made national headlines, so to speak. But yeah, if someone's got a tree that they've had a long time or there's something that's really precious to them, it's better maybe to leave it with somebody who knows what they're doing than just chance it with a friend or neighbour. So watering can be crucial. What you're trying to achieve is you give the tree a good soaking and then you leave it till it virtually uses all that water up and then you give him a good soaking again. So till you get used to your tree, you have to sort of check it every day, just touch the soil surface. Wherever it's still moist, leave it and check it the next day. As soon as you feel it's dry, then you give it a good watering. And I would always say when you're touching the tree each day, if you get to the stage where you're not sure, shall I or shan't I? Does it need water? I would always say, if in doubt, water it. But if you can master the watering with bonsai, then most of the other general sort of looking after the tree is straightforward. But watering really is crucial.
As I say, from bitter experience, I know it is. So there's so much in your book in terms of how to do it and the different styles that you can try and achieve. And it's just pretty much everything I wanted to know about bonsai. But a few of the things that really piqued my interest were to do with the kind of aesthetics of it. And you've got a section in there about leaving deadwood as part of the plant, which I found fascinating and hadn't actually seen before. So could you just talk a little bit about that and say why that is a good look to try and achieve if you want to?
Well, often when we create our own bonsai, we might be working with a garden centre plant that we've bought, a conifer from a garden centre that we're going to create into a bonsai. We're going to style it as a tree. So we're often working with young material. So you can introduce some deadwood into your design, into your tree, then it can make this young piece of material appear much older, as though it stood the test of time and been battered by weather. And so aesthetically, the deadwood can give the tree a greater presence and make it look much older. Going to the other extreme, we've already talked about how you can observe trees in nature and you try and create a tree that looks like a natural tree. But at the other extreme, you can have a bonsai where the deadwood almost becomes the main factor about the tree. The tree almost becomes a living sculpture. So the deadwood, the shape of the deadwood, the textures of the deadwood is the important thing, is the essence of the tree. And then often there may be just one live vein on the deadwood with a small amount of foliage, which is just keeping the tree alive. So we've gone totally now from a natural looking tree image to a living sculpture. And this can be quite dramatic, and these trees are often seen in exhibitions. But in some ways, they do still reflect nature, because if you look in parts of the world where they get extremes, often you see pictures of trees growing above the Nevada desert, clinging to rocks. And these trees are often like living sculptures. They're really old trees that have got lots of deadwood on them and just a few live branches keeping them alive. And that's all been done by the harsh environment that they've been grown in. One of the things in bonsai that is very popular is what we call Yamadori bonsai. And these are trees that are collected from the wild. And obviously, if you go collecting trees from the wild, you have to have permission from the landowner. In Japan, for example, trees were collected off the mountain, which had been dwarfed by nature. And then if you can get them growing in a bonsai pot, you have a tree which has the maturity, it has the old bark, it has the natural deadwood that's been created by nature. So you finish up with basically a small specimen bonsai in a pot, but the tree itself is maybe hundreds of years old. So deadwood can be quite an important feature in bonsai.
Yeah, it looked amazing. And the pictures that you had in the book where you'd utilised it, it was just incredible. And like you say, did lend just a different look and feeling of age to a tree. So obviously that is quite a specialist technique, and you do need some other bits and pieces to achieve that look. And I wondered, is there much that you need in the way of specialist equipment?
I think when you first start out in bonsai, you can improvise with lots of things. So you can use some old kitchen scissors for pruning, you can use garden secateurs for pruning heavier branches, you can use an old fork as a rake for combing out the roots. So you can improvise with things from your household kit to get you started in bonsai. But then I think if the hobby becomes quite important to you, then it's a bit like DIY. If you're doing DIY and you've got all the power tools and everything, it makes life easier and more enjoyable. And I think it's the same with bonsai. You gradually get the toolkit together. There are lots of different types of cutters and wire cutters and all sorts of different tools, but you don't need to buy them all to start with. You can acquire a reasonable toolkit with birthday and Christmas presents, and you can gradually build your equipment up. You know, most of my students now come with a full toolkit, and it just makes life, say, more enjoyable and easier when you're doing these various tasks. But don't let it frighten anyone that you have to suddenly invest in all this equipment to do bonsai, because you can certainly improvise from what you have in your own home.
So with that in mind as well, it seems to be the sort of hobby where you either do what I've done, which is buy a very small, cheap tree or been given it, sadly, it's met an untimely end, or you really get the bit between your teeth and really go for it. So if you were one of those people who was thinking of getting into it more seriously, what would be a really good starting point? Where can you go to get information? So, where can people go to get that kind of help?
When I started doing bonsai, it was all about books. So any bonsai book that I saw, I would buy it. And anything to do with bonsai, I would buy the book. Whereas now we have the internet. The only problem is, and I think this is not just about bonsai, but it's every subject, there is so much good information on the internet, but there's also a lot of bad information. And when you first start with something, unfortunately, you don't know which is the good material and which is the bad material. I think if you really want to get into bonsai, there are lots of bonsai clubs all over the country. So if you can seek out by contacting maybe the Federation of British Bonsai Societies, you can find out where the nearest club is to you. And if you join the club, you'll find a lot of like-minded enthusiasts who've all started like you, and we're only too happy to give you advice, maybe even pass on some trees that they no longer want. And you also find they'll give you more information about things in your local area where you can find material, and they'll do everything they can to encourage you. So I think that's as good as anything. Certainly there are books out there as well, and that's the reason I'm talking to you about my book. But the internet, I think, you just have to be wary. The information can be so contradictory, and so you can tend to confuse you more, because one site is telling you to do this and then the other site is telling you to do exactly the opposite, and you just don't know which way to jump. So the internet can sometimes cause as many problems as what it can solve. But I think if you can find someone local, there are also bonsai nurseries up and down the country. So if you go to a proper specialist bonsai nursery, again, they can point you in the right direction and give you good advice, because obviously they want you to keep coming back as a customer. So I would say bonsai clubs and bonsai nurseries are the best way to really get started and gain some momentum to get into the hobby.
Just as a final question, John, I'm going to throw this one at you as a curveball, but as you've been talking, I think there are a lot of fundamental principles that you learn through bonsai. And I wonder, do you think that being involved with bonsai can actually make you a better gardener all round?
Bonsai takes your gardening experience to a whole new level, to be honest, because when we work on a bonsai, as that tree develops, you work on every branch. Like if I'm refining a specimen bonsai now, I have to go over every branch on that tree, every branch, every twig, to decide whether I need to prune it, whether I need to pinch it, or what do I need to do. So you get to know the tree intimately, you know every inch of the tree, and it's this partnership between you and nature that creates this bonsai. You harness nature by pruning the tree at the right time, by providing the right conditions, by taking advantage of the seasons. And so it enables you to start with basically nothing, like a bare stump, and yet you can create something out of that that really looks quite magnificent. But that's you working with nature and harnessing nature. And I think a lot of people do come into bonsai from an interest in gardening, but bonsai just enables you to take it to another level and really get to know your tree inside out. You do bond with, it's like having children, you do bond with them. You get them through the bad times, the bad winters. You get them through stressful times when they've been attacked by aphids and things. So you're basically just the servant of the tree, because he's going to live longer than you are. So when you die, your trees are going to be there. So hopefully you can get someone in your family, encourage them to show an interest so they can carry on your work. So you're basically just the custodian of the bonsai, you're his servant, and you look after him. But it does enable anyone who's interested in gardening to get so much closer to nature, which is what I think a lot of people in modern society are seeking these days, that closer contact with nature and the gardens and plants.
I love the thought of serving the tree and passing it on as an heirloom to another person who can carry on your legacy. Not enough thought is given to plants as part of the historical record at a smaller scale, in my humble opinion. It's an interesting thing to think about. Thank you to John for the interview and to you for listening. Here's Dr. Ian Bedford now, talking about a bug that can put a dent in your spring cheer.
The wonderful sight of flowering springtime bulbs, heralding a fresh new growing season in our gardens, can often be tinged with sadness when eagerly awaited daffodil flowers fail to appear amongst their clusters of green bladed leaves. But why are some of these bulbs missing the one part of their annual growth cycle that we'd have planted them in our gardens for? Well, there's a few reasons why daffodils and their related species might come up blind, as we call it. Sometimes it's in response to excessively dry or wet ground conditions during the previous year, or perhaps it's due to the age of the bulb. But it could also be a sign that the bulb is diseased, or that it's being damaged by one of the very few soil-dwelling insects that are known to feed on daffodil bulbs. In particular, the large Narcissus bulbfly, a bug that resembles a small brown hairy bumblebee, often displaying the banded markings of a bumblebee too. But unlike a bumblebee, this bug only has one pair of wings, and it's unable to sting. Because it's a hoverfly, a group of flies that are renowned for mimicking the appearance of bees and wasps. However, despite being widespread, the large bulbfly is not actually a native species to Britain, since it was accidentally brought here with imported bulbs during the late 19th century. And so, during May each year, the bulbflies will be hatching from their underground pupae and can often be seen feeding on the nectar of garden flowers, where they'll mate. The females then depart to search for senescing daffodil leaves, where they crawl down to lay their eggs on the neck of the bulbs. These eggs soon hatch into little creamy white maggots that wiggle down to the bottom of the bulb, where they'll tunnel inside through the base and begin devouring the fleshy centre, where they'll destroy the following year's flower buds that were starting to form. Then, come the following spring, the now fully grown maggots emerge from the damaged bulbs to pupate within the surrounding soil, where they remain until May. And so it would be the bulbs that were damaged by the maggots that grew leaves but not flowers before they invariably rotted and died. Unfortunately, though, there's little that can be done to effectively control large bulbfly, other than remove the weak plants during early spring, and perhaps cover senescing plants with fleece during May.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.